The sound of the doorbell echoed in the quiet lobby, signaling yet another visitor entering the bank. But this was not just any ordinary day, and this was not just any ordinary visitor. The man who walked in had a presence that seemed to demand attention. His eyes scanned the room, as if weighing the space, taking in the sharp white walls, the polished marble floors, the gleaming teller stations. But none of it seemed to matter, because when his gaze fell on the bank manager, something in the air shifted. It was a warm afternoon, and everything seemed normal. But as the man approached counter, tension in room began to build. The bank manager, who had been calmly working behind the desk, looked up. Her smile, the kind of smile meant to make customers feel welcome, quickly vanished. For a split second, she hesitated. Then, without thinking, she asked him a question that would soon haunt her. "Can I help you, sir?" The man, with his simple yet confident demeanor, gave a small nod and replied, "I'm here to open an account." The words seemed innocent, but something about the way he looked, his attire, his style, made the manager feel uncomfortable. His clothes weren't what she expected. His appearance was unpolished, almost as if he hadn't taken time to prepare himself for this kind of place. The thick, worn-out jacket he wore seemed out of place against the modern, professional backdrop of bank. His shoes, scuffed and dusty, stood as a stark contrast to the pristine floors. The way his hair was styled, a bit unruly, in his own unique way, only added to the unease she felt. Without even thinking about it, she hesitated, staring for just a moment longer than was necessary. And then, before he could speak again, she made the call. She turned to her colleague, standing a few feet away, and quietly murmured, "Can you help this gentleman out?" The colleague raised an eyebrow, glancing at the man. But even she knew what the manager was trying to say without saying it. The man's appearance, the way he presented himself, didn't align with what the bank expected. In her mind, there was no way someone like him could open an account here. What happened next wasn't just the result of a momentary lapse in judgment, it was a reflection of something deeper. Prejudices that lived in the unspoken, in the silent assumptions people made about each other. The man, who had been waiting for a response, turned and walked out the door, his expression unreadable. He didn't raise his voice, or make a scene. He simply walked away, his shoulders straight, as though he already knew what had just happened. But little did the manager know that this seemingly harmless encounter would soon lead her into a whirlwind of regret, self-reflection, and ultimately, a lesson she wasn't expecting. Days passed. The man's face haunted her thoughts, as if his presence lingered in the back of her mind. She had gone home that evening, replaying the events over and over again, questioning her own actions. Was it really that he didn't fit in here? She thought. Or was it that I just didn't take the time to see beyond his appearance? She couldn't help but wonder. But every time she tried to push the thoughts aside, they came rushing back. Then, on the third day after the incident, something unexpected happened. The man returned to the bank, but this time, he wasn't alone. He had come with a purpose, and he was prepared to confront the manager directly. The bank manager saw him standing at the entrance. This time, he was dressed differently, cleaner, sharper. His clothes were more formal, his hair neatly styled. It was as if he had intentionally prepared himself for the encounter. But she couldn't shake the feeling that this visit wasn't about his appearance. It was about something deeper, something that had to do with the way she had treated him the first time. Her heart raced. The thought that this moment could be a turning point for both of them, that this man could hold the key to understanding something she had never stopped to think about, began to weigh heavily on her. She saw him walk toward her again, his steps deliberate. But this time, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the look in his eyes that said he had something important to say. The air between them seemed charged, as if the weight of what had happened before was finally coming to a head. He didn't say a word when he arrived at the counter. Instead, he simply looked at her, his eyes fixed on hers. The silence in the air was almost unbearable. It was the kind of silence where words didn't need to be spoken to understand the gravity of the moment. And that's when she saw it, a flicker of recognition in his gaze. It wasn't anger. It wasn't disappointment. It was something more powerful than either of those emotions. It was a quiet acknowledgement that he had been hurt, and that the bank had made a mistake. The manager's heart sank, and for the first time, she realized how wrong she had been. But what happened next? How did she face the consequences of her actions? What would the man say in response? How could she possibly make things right? That's where the story picks up. Because when the truth finally comes to light, both of their worlds will change forever. Stay tuned, because this story isn't just about a mistake made at a bank. It's about understanding, redemption, and breaking down the walls we often build between each other. The man stood silently in front of the bank manager, his gaze steady but unreadable. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. The manager could feel her heart thudding in her chest. It wasn't just the uncertainty of what to say next, or the fear that he might call her out for her behavior. It was the sinking realization that she had, in some way, judged him unfairly. Her mind replayed that day over and over again, the moment she saw him walk in, the automatic assumptions she had made. In the past few days, the guilt had grown stronger. She couldn't ignore the feeling that something was deeply wrong. She wasn't just guilty of a momentary lapse in judgment. She had looked at him and seen a stereotype. She had looked at him and didn't even try to see him for who he really was. But now, here he was, standing before her, dressed in more formal attire than before. His clothes were crisp, his shoes polished. His appearance, in her mind, was the perfect image of someone who belonged in this space. But this time, she knew that wasn't what mattered. He shifted his weight, breaking the silence, and for the first time, she noticed the tension in his posture. He wasn't angry, but she could see the seriousness in the way he held himself. It was the kind of presence that demanded respect, but also the kind that made her feel exposed. She could feel the weight of her own decisions that she had made in the blink of an eye, but that had already altered the course of this man's day, and perhaps her own future as well. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice quieter this time, more careful than before. The words came out like a question, though she already knew the answer. His eyes stayed on her for a long moment, as if he was deciding how to respond. His lips pressed together, and then, with a calmness that almost startled her, he said, "I came here the other day, you remember?" The manager nodded, though she could already feel the tightening in her chest. She was afraid this conversation was about to go in a direction she wasn't prepared for. "I came in to open an account, and when I did, you didn't want to help me." His voice was measured, not accusatory, but heavy with the weight of the truth. "You didn't even give me a chance." She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Instead, she simply stared at him, feeling the sting of his statement, but knowing she deserved it. How could she have let her assumptions control her actions? How could she have been so quick to judge? "I'm sorry," she finally managed to say. The words felt hollow, but they were all she could offer. It wasn't enough, not nearly enough, but it was all she had in that moment. The man shook his head, almost as if he hadn't expected an apology. "It's not enough," he said quietly, but there was no anger in his voice, just an undeniable sadness. "I didn't ask for an apology. I asked for a chance. A chance." The words hung in the air between them. The manager swallowed hard, her mind racing. She had denied him a chance that day. But why? What had made her believe that he wasn't someone worthy of the bank's attention? Was it his appearance? Was it the way he carried himself? Or was it something deeper, something embedded in the way society had taught her to view people like him? As she struggled to make sense of it, she glanced at the other employees in the bank. They were watching from a distance, their expressions carefully neutral, but she could see the unspoken judgment in their eyes. They were waiting to see how she would handle this situation. They were waiting to see if she would own up to her mistake, or if she would try to hide behind excuses. The man was still standing there, waiting. His silence spoke louder than any words he could have said. And in that silence, the manager could feel the weight of her failure growing heavier. "I didn't expect this to happen," he finally said, breaking the silence. "I didn't expect to have to come back and prove myself." The words stung, but she knew they were true. She had assumed things about him, things that weren't fair, and now she had to face the consequences. The shame in her chest grew, but beneath it, there was a flicker of something else, a recognition of her own failure, a sense of accountability she hadn't allowed herself to feel before. But even as that realization settled in, a part of her wanted to defend herself. She wanted to explain. She wanted to say that she hadn't meant to hurt him, that her actions weren't intentional. But she knew better than to make excuses. Excuses wouldn't change what had happened. The damage was already done. She met his gaze again, and this time, her voice was stronger. "I didn't give you a chance," she admitted. "And for that, I'm sorry." For the first time since he walked in, the man's expression softened. He still didn't smile, but there was a shift in his demeanor. It was as if her words had reached him, even if they weren't enough to erase past. "That's all I wanted," he said quietly. "A chance. To be seen for who I am, not for what I look like." She swallowed again, feeling the weight of those words. They weren't just about this one incident. They were about everything, the assumptions people made, the stereotypes that lingered in society, the way people were too quick to judge others based on their appearance or their background. And now, standing in front of her, the man was asking for something more than an apology. He was asking her to see him not as someone who didn't fit the bank's image, but as someone who deserved respect, just like anyone else. "I can't change what happened," she said, her voice softer now, "but I want to make it right. I want to help you." He glanced around as if weighing her sincerity. "How?" he asked, his voice still low, but with a hint of curiosity. The manager took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She had no idea what the right answer was, but she knew she couldn't leave things like this. "I'll open the account for you," she said. "Right now, if you'd like." The man nodded, his expression unreadable. "That would be a start," he said. As she walked him through the process, she could feel the weight of the situation hanging over them. The other employees remained at a distance, watching with quiet intensity. She could hear the faint sound of keyboards clicking, the hum of the air conditioning, but none of it registered in her mind. Her focus was entirely on this man, this stranger who had come into the bank just days ago, only to be turned away because of how he looked. But now, as she handed him the paperwork to sign, she knew the real work was just beginning. She had to prove to him that she could see him for who he truly was. And maybe, just maybe, in doing so, she could begin to understand her own role in this moment, and in the world beyond. As the man left the bank that day, she watched him walk away, feeling a sense of unease settle in her stomach. She had done what she could to make things right in the immediate sense, but there was still something unresolved. He had asked for a chance, and while she had given him one, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much larger journey for both of them. The tension lingered in the air, a promise that the story wasn't over. There was more to learn. There was more to be understood. And for the first time, the manager wasn't sure where this story would lead. The man had walked out the door. But in a way, his presence was still there, still hanging in the air. She could feel it, even long after he had gone. And that feeling wasn't going away anytime soon. The days that followed were heavy. The manager found herself unable to stop thinking about the encounter. Every time she walked into the bank, she expected to see him again. But the man didn't return the next day, or the day after that. He seemed to disappear, leaving only the weight of her guilt lingering in the air. It was as if his presence had left an indelible mark on the bank and on her conscience. Her co-workers noticed the change too. The usual banter in the office was gone, replaced by a tense silence that clung to every corner of the room. They had all seen what had happened, how the manager had denied the man that day, and though no one said anything directly, it was clear that they were all wondering how she would handle the situation moving forward. They were watching her closely, waiting for her to make the next move. Every conversation at work, no matter how mundane, seemed to carry the weight of that one moment. It was as if time had stopped, and everything around her had become a reminder of the mistake she had made. She couldn't shake the memory of his face, the quiet sadness in his eyes, when he had stood there, asking for a chance, and she had turned him away. Then, on the fourth day after he had left the bank, the phone rang. It was late in the afternoon, and she was sitting at her desk, staring at the same paperwork she had been going over all day. Her hand hovered over the mouse, clicking absent-mindedly between tabs on her computer, but her mind was elsewhere. The phone startled her, and she grabbed the receiver quickly. "Hello," she said, trying to sound composed, though her voice wavered slightly. "Is this the manager of the downtown branch?" A voice on the other end asked, a sharp, formal tone cutting through the line. "Yes, this is," she replied, feeling a tight knot form in her stomach. She couldn't help but wonder if this was about the man. Was this his way of making a formal complaint? Was he going to bring legal action against the bank? Or was this something else entirely? I'm calling from corporate. There's been a report of a complaint filed regarding a recent interaction at your branch, the voice said, its tone unyielding. I'd like you to come in for a meeting tomorrow morning. This matter needs to be addressed immediately. The manager's heart raced. A complaint? Her stomach dropped at the thought. She hadn't expected corporate to get involved so quickly, but now it was clear that her actions had repercussions beyond the walls of the bank. She hadn't even told anyone about the encounter. No one from work knew the full extent of the situation, only that the man had walked in and things hadn't gone smoothly. But someone had spoken up. Someone had noticed. And now it was about to get even worse. Of course, she said, though her voice was barely more than a whisper. I'll be there. The phone call ended, and she sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the receiver in her hand. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt this level of anxiety. Her palms were sweaty, and the tightness in her chest wouldn't ease. She had never been in trouble with corporate before. She had always prided herself on being professional, on doing things by the book. But now, this mistake, the one she had tried to bury, was catching up with her. She thought of the man again. He had been so calm, so collected when he confronted her. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't caused a scene. Instead, he had spoken with a quiet intensity that had shaken her more than any outburst could have. He had asked for a chance, and she had denied him that. Now, she was left wondering if he had spoken to someone higher up. Had he complained to corporate? Had he taken his grievance to someone who would listen? The next morning, the manager barely slept. The night had been long, filled with restless tossing and turning. When the alarm went off, she hit snooze and stared at the ceiling for a few more minutes. She was exhausted, both mentally and physically, but there was no way to avoid the meeting now. Corporate would be waiting. By the time she arrived at the office, the tension in her chest had only grown heavier. She entered through the bank's back entrance, hoping that the familiar smell of coffee and the quiet buzz of the computers would bring her some comfort. But nothing felt familiar. She passed her colleagues in the hallway, their eyes quickly darting away as she walked by. No one said anything, but the silence spoke volumes. When she stepped into the meeting room, she was met by two corporate representatives, both with expressions that left little room for pleasantries. The air between them was cold and businesslike. She took a seat at the table, feeling her hands shake as she folded them in her lap. Mrs. Lawson, one of the representatives began, glancing at a clipboard before him. We've received a complaint from a customer about an interaction he had at your branch last week. This has been flagged as a serious concern. Can you explain what happened? The question was sharp, like a blade cutting through the tension in the room. She swallowed hard, her mouth dry. For a moment, she was at a loss for words. How could she explain this? How could she describe the situation without revealing how her own biases had led to the mistake? I made a mistake, she said slowly, the weight of the words hitting her all at once. I judged him based on his appearance. I didn't give him a fair chance. There was a brief silence as the representatives exchanged glances. One of them, a woman with short blonde hair, spoke next. And what do you plan to do about it? The manager's stomach twisted. The question was simple, but its implications were anything but. What could she do? How could she fix what had been broken? She had already acknowledged that she had wronged the man. But would corporate even care? Would they see her sincerity, or would they only see her as a liability, someone who had failed in her role as manager? I'm not sure, she admitted, her voice trembling. I've tried to make things right by offering to help him, but I don't know if that will be enough. The representatives exchanged another look, and the silence seemed to stretch on forever. Then, the man with the clipboard cleared his throat. We've contacted the customer, he said. He's agreed to come in for a meeting later today. The words felt like a punch to the gut. The man was coming in again, but this time it wouldn't just be a casual visit. He was meeting with corporate now, and everything was on the line. If he chose to escalate things, if he decided to press charges, she could lose her job. Worse, the entire branch could suffer because of her actions. But more than the fear of losing her job more than the anxiety about corporate's judgment, was the nagging feeling that she hadn't done enough. She hadn't really made amends for what she had done. She had opened the account, yes, but that wasn't the same as undoing the hurt she had caused. She had barely scratched the surface of what this man might be feeling. As the meeting drew to a close, the representatives gave her a stiff nod, and the tension in the air thickened. The feeling of impending disaster lingered long after they had left the room. She was left alone, pacing back and forth, her mind racing. The man was coming. He was going to face corporate. And she wasn't sure how it was all going to end. But one thing was certain, the next few hours would decide everything. The minutes dragged on like hours, as she sat alone in her office, the hum of the fluorescent lights above almost deafening in its silence. The meeting with corporate had left her feeling hollow, like a fragile shell that could shatter at any moment. She kept running over the same thoughts. Had she done enough? Was this meeting with the man going to be the final test? And more than anything, what if he decided to make it public? What if this small misstep would cost her everything? She glanced at the clock. He was supposed to be here any moment, walking through the doors again. Only this time, it wouldn't be a simple exchange. There were real consequences hanging in the balance now. Corporate had made it clear, the situation was serious. If the man didn't feel satisfied, if he chose to escalate things, the repercussions could be massive. She had no doubt about that. Suddenly, the phone on her desk rang. She jumped, startled by the sudden break in the silence. She picked it up, her fingers trembling. "Mrs. Lawson," a familiar voice said. It was the voice of the same corporate representative from the day before. "I just wanted to check in with you. The customer is on his way in. You should prepare yourself." The words were polite, but there was something in the tone that set off a fresh wave of anxiety in her chest. "Of course," she responded, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'll be ready." But even as she hung up, a strange sense of dread gripped her heart. She had thought she had prepared herself, but now it felt like there was something she was missing, something that was about to shake everything she thought she knew about this situation. It was almost 11 a.m. when the man walked into the bank. He was dressed in a sharp grey suit this time, his presence even more commanding than the first day they had met. There was no sign of the frustration or sadness he had worn the first time. Now he seemed almost calm, though there was a certain tension in the way he moved. His eyes scanned the room, but when they landed on her, he didn't hesitate. Without a word, he walked over to her desk. His presence seemed to draw all the eyes in the bank, but this time, there was no disapproving whisper behind his back. No one dared to look away. The manager stood up, her heart pounding. This was it. This was the moment she had dreaded, but also the moment she had hoped would come an opportunity to make things right. But as she approached him, something about the way he was standing struck her. There was a slight tension in his jaw, something that told her this was far from over. "I've been waiting," she said, trying to mask the anxiety in her voice. "How are you? How can I help?" The man looked at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment she thought he might say something cutting or bitter. But then his gaze softened, almost imperceptibly. "I'm here because we need to talk," he said, his voice calm but carrying an edge she couldn't quite place. "I know," she said, nodding. "And I want to make things right, if I can." He didn't respond. Instead, he motioned toward the meeting room, where corporate was waiting. She led the way, her steps quick but uncertain. As they entered the room, the two corporate representatives were already seated at the long table, watching them closely. The man took a seat across from them, while the manager sat at the head of the table, feeling the weight of everyone's eyes on her. The air between them was tense, thick with unspoken words. The corporate representative with the clipboard cleared his throat and glanced at the man. "We've reviewed your complaint and would like to hear from you directly about the situation. Please, go ahead." The man's gaze shifted toward her once more before he began to speak, but the words that came out next were nothing like what she expected. "I wasn't just upset about the way I was treated here," he said, his voice low but steady. "That's not the real reason I'm here." The words hung in the air, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. The manager blinked, caught off guard. She hadn't prepared for this. Hadn't he been upset about the way he'd been turned away? She had assumed the conversation would revolve around the events of that day, but now it seemed that there was more, so much more, that she had overlooked. "Then why are you here?" one of the corporate representatives asked, a hint of impatience in her voice. The man paused, his eyes flicking toward the manager, before he spoke again, more deliberately this time. "The truth is, I've been watching this bank for a while. And it's not just about me. It's about how your branch operates. It's about how people are treated here, and it's about how this system doesn't really care for the people who walk through these doors." The tension in the room grew palpable. The manager's heart sank. What was he saying? What was he accusing them of? He leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked onto hers. "The way you treated me was a symptom of a much bigger problem. And I think you know that." The manager's mind raced. She couldn't process what he was saying. Hadn't he come here simply because of the way he was treated? Hadn't he wanted to express his frustration, to maybe receive an apology? Why was he now suggesting something far more serious? He turned his gaze back to the corporate representatives, who looked just as stunned as she felt. "There's been a pattern here," he said. "And I've seen it before. People like me, people who don't fit the typical image of a bank customer, are pushed away. Not just in this branch, but in every branch." The room fell silent. No one spoke for what felt like an eternity. The manager could feel her breath hitch in her throat, her mind struggling to keep up with what he was revealing. This wasn't just about a simple misunderstanding anymore. This wasn't just about one man who had been turned away. This was a much larger issue, an accusation of systemic discrimination, one that could send shockwaves through the entire institution. The corporate representatives exchanged uneasy glances. Finally, the man who had been silent for most of the conversation spoke, his voice tense. "What exactly are you implying?" he asked, though his tone lacked the usual confidence. The man took a deep breath, as if he had been preparing for this moment for a long time. "I'm implying that your branch and this entire bank has a problem, and I think it's time that someone took a stand." The words hung heavy in the air, the implication clear. The manager's heart raced. This wasn't just about her job anymore. This was about an accusation that could shake the bank's reputation to its core. And if the man was right, if this was part of a larger, more widespread issue, there was no telling what the fallout might be. And then, just as quickly as the words had come, the man leaned back in his chair, his face calm again, almost as if he had said what he needed to say, and now he was done. But the damage had been done. The room was electric with tension. The corporate representatives were clearly rattled. The manager felt like she had been punched in the gut. She had no idea how to respond. Everything she had worked for, everything she had known about her job and the bank, was suddenly in question. And no one knew what was coming next. The stakes had just escalated in a way no one could have predicted, and the tension in the air was unbearable. How would the bank respond to the man's accusations? Would they deny everything, or take a hard look at their practices? And more importantly, what would happen to the manager as the truth continued to unravel? The silence in the room was deafening after the man's words. The corporate representatives sat frozen, eyes wide in disbelief, as if they had been caught off guard by the gravity of the accusation. The manager's hands were clenched tightly in her lap, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never imagined her day would unfold like this, that one decision, a single misstep, would spiral into something so much bigger, so much more dangerous. The man leaned back in his chair, his expression calm, almost detached now, as if he had already said what needed to be said. But for the manager, this was the moment that felt like everything was unraveling, as if the very foundation of her career, her values, and even her sense of right and wrong was crumbling before her eyes. The corporate representatives exchanged glances, their eyes no longer filled with the confidence they had shown earlier. The tension in the air was so thick, it was almost suffocating. Finally, the man with the clipboard cleared his throat and spoke. "We'll need to investigate this further," he said, his voice noticeably shakier than before. "This is serious." The man nodded. "You do that. You'll find that what I'm saying is true." As the corporate reps scrambled to gather themselves, the manager found her voice weak but present. I'm sorry," she said, addressing the man. Her voice trembled, but she had to say it. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I made a mistake." He looked at her, his gaze softening. "I know you didn't mean to," he said quietly. "But that doesn't change the fact that it happened. The weight of his words hit her harder than she expected. She had been so focused on defending herself and protecting her job that she had never stopped to really consider the impact of her actions. And now, the situation was spiraling beyond anyone's control. "Maybe," she began, swallowing hard, "maybe I was just too quick to judge." He nodded. "Maybe." There was a long pause, the kind that felt like it stretched on forever. The room was still buzzing with the unspoken tension, but now, for the first time, it felt as if something might be shifting, as if this encounter might not end in disaster after all. But then, just as the manager was about to offer a real apology, something happened that none of them were prepared for. The door to the room opened suddenly, and the bank's senior vice president walked in. She was a tall, authoritative woman, known for her no-nonsense approach. Her presence alone was enough to command attention, and when she saw the man sitting at the table, her expression immediately changed. She strode forward, her heels clicking on the tile, and stopped in front of the man. "You," she said, her voice firm. "What are you doing here?" The man raised an eyebrow, but didn't say anything. "This is private," the vice president snapped. "You shouldn't be here." The room was tense again, the air crackling with uncertainty. The corporate representatives looked at each other, clearly startled. The manager had no idea what was happening. Why had the vice president come in now? What was she doing here? The man's expression shifted, growing more guarded. "I'm here because this is bigger than any of you," he said, his voice steady. "It's time to face the truth." The senior vice president's eyes narrowed. "Face the truth?" She scoffed. "You're just trying to make trouble. We've got procedures, policies, things that are fair." The man stood up, his voice calm but unyielding. "Your policies have failed people like me for years." The vice president took a deep breath, clearly trying to maintain her composure. But it was obvious now that there was more to the situation than anyone had realized. The way she was acting, the sharpness in her words, the defensiveness in her posture, revealed something she hadn't said aloud. "You have no idea what you're talking about," she said. But then, just as quickly as she had spoken, her gaze shifted, and for the first time, the manager saw a crack in her fade. It was barely noticeable, but it was there. A momentary lapse, a sign of something darker. The man saw it too. He turned to the manager, his expression unreadable. "There's something you need to know," he said quietly. She blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" The man's eyes were locked onto the vice president now. "It's not just the branch. It's not just the employees. There's something deeper. Something much more systemic." The manager's heart pounded in her chest. What was he talking about? What was he suggesting? Before she could ask, the man pulled out his phone and slid it across the table. On the screen, a set of documents was visible: internal emails, memos, some of which had the bank's logo stamped across the top. The vice president's face drained of color when she saw the papers on the phone screen. "These are from the last 6 months, the man said, his voice cold and deliberate. "They show that the discrimination is not just happening here. It's happening at multiple branches. These policies that the bank claims to have in place, they're just smoke and mirrors." The manager felt her knees weaken as she stared at the documents. This was bigger than she'd imagined. It wasn't just about her mistake. It was about a larger issue of institutionalized discrimination that went far beyond the walls of her branch. The bank, which had prided itself on its customer service and inclusivity, was now exposed as part of a much deeper problem. The vice president's hand shook as she reached for the phone, trying to swipe it away, but the man held it firmly in place. "Do you really want to pretend that none of this is happening?" he asked, his voice quieter now, but no less intense. "Do you want to keep protecting this system?" The vice president looked at the documents, her face filled with dread. The weight of the truth was too heavy to deny. Her lips parted, but she couldn't speak. The room seemed to spin as the implications sank in. The corporate representatives were looking back and forth between the man and the vice president. The manager felt as if the ground had been pulled out from beneath her. She had no idea how deep the corruption went, but it was clear now that her role in this was only the tip of the iceberg. Then the vice president turned to her, her face hardening. "You didn't see anything," she said in a low, dangerous tone. "If you know what's good for you, you'll stay out of this." The manager blinked, stunned by the threat. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, the man stood up, his voice sharp and commanding. No, she's not going to cover for you. None of us are. And with that, the silence fell once again, but it wasn't the same kind of silence from before. This time, it was heavier. It was the silence that came with knowing everything was about to change. The truth had been laid bare, and the stakes had never been higher. The man turned to the manager one last time. You'll be fine, he said. But you need to decide if you want to be part of the change or part of the problem. With that, he left the room, leaving the manager to process the depth of the truth she had just been confronted with. The vice president sat down, her face darkened by fury. She said nothing, but her expression said everything. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. And for the manager, it was a new chapter 1 that would force her to choose where her loyalty lay. The minutes ticked by, after the man walked out of the room, and the weight of the moment seemed to hang in the air, thick and unshakable. The vice president, her jaw clenched in silent rage, stared out the window, as if the city outside could offer her some solace, some escape from the truth that was now gnawing at her. She didn't say anything, didn't move. She simply sat there, frozen in place. The manager, on the other hand, felt as if her heart was still racing, her hands trembling. She glanced around the room at the corporate representatives, who were now looking at her with a strange combination of uncertainty and guilt. They had been silent for so long, it was as if they didn't know how to proceed. Finally, one of them cleared his throat and stood. I'll get started on a full internal investigation, he said, though his voice lacked the usual authority and confidence. The vice president turned her head sharply toward him, her expression dark. Do you really think that's going to fix this? She asked coldly. The man hesitated, clearly unnerved by her tone. It's the only option we have right now. The vice president's lips twisted into a bitter smile. It's too late for that. He already knows everything. The words cut through the room like a knife, and the corporate representatives went silent once again. The vice president's eyes flashed with something the manager couldn't quite place: anger, regret, fear? Or was it something deeper, something she wasn't ready to confront? For the manager, the weight of the truth was only just beginning to settle in. She had always been proud of her work, her role in the bank, but now, with everything exposed, it felt as if her entire world had shifted. This wasn't just about a single interaction with one customer. This was about an entire system, one that she had been a part of. And now she was faced with the reality of what that system had been doing to people like the man, the very person she had once brushed aside. She glanced toward the vice president, whose features were now hardened, as if she were in the process of coming to terms with the enormity of the situation. But the manager couldn't look away. What had been going on behind closed doors? What was the vice president so afraid of? Her thoughts were interrupted when the door opened and a few of the bank's higher-ups walked in. They were discussing the next steps, a formal investigation into the man's claims, how to handle the potential fallout, and whether they needed to make a public statement. It was all technical, methodical, but the manager could tell that they were missing the point entirely. They were focused on damage control, on trying to keep the bank's reputation intact, but they weren't addressing the real issue, the culture that had allowed something like this to happen in the first place. She stood up abruptly, her voice breaking the quiet. This isn't just about covering up what happened. This is about changing how we do things, changing how people like him are treated. The room fell silent, all eyes now on her. The vice president's expression grew even darker, and for a moment, the manager thought she might lash out. But instead, the vice president merely let out a deep, exhausted sigh and shook her head. I've been part of this system for too long to believe that it can be changed, she said bitterly. There's too much at stake. Too many people who benefit from things staying the way they are. The manager's heart sank at her words. It was clear that the vice president had given up. She had stopped believing in any real chance for change long ago. But the manager wasn't ready to give up, not yet. I'm not giving up, she said firmly. And you shouldn't either.